Good afternoon and welcome to the 34th Annual Miami Book Fair. My name is Pascal Charlot. I am the Dean of the Honors College, and it is an absolute pleasure to be here with you this afternoon. You know, this moment is always bittersweet because it's been such an awesome week. We hate to see it go, but it's going to have to go at some point, right? So I'm going to ask you if you could please join me in thanking all of our incredible sponsors who helped make this event possible. The Knight Foundation, OHL Orellano, the Bachelor Foundation, and of course the DeGroat Foundation. Also, we're very fortunate for all of our local champions who give to the fair, and many of them are here right now. Will you please give our friends of the fair a round of applause? It is customary for us to request that you please turn off your cell phone if you have not already. Also note that the authors will be signing in the autograph area to the right of the elevator. We're very, very fortunate today to have with us Charles DeGroat of the Grout Foundation, who's a co-director and friendly and active supporter of the fair. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here this afternoon because these are two of my favorite authors. Scott Turow is the author of 10 best-selling works of fiction, including Identical, Innocent, Presumed Innocent, and The Burden of Proof, as well as 2 nonfiction books. He frequently contributes to publications such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the New Yorker. He taught creative writing at Stanford University before earning his law degree, and he's currently a partner in an international law firm in Chicago. His latest novel, Testimony, is a page-turning legal thriller about an American prosecutor's investigation of a refugee camp's mystifying disappearance. The New York Times Book Review described Testimony as at once a thriller, a story of middle-aged angst, an exposition of international law, and an exploration of an intensely serious and very nasty episode in recent history. And I highly recommend the book. I read it as soon as it came out. Carl Hiaasen was born and raised in Florida. He's an author of 13 previous novels, including bestsellers Bad Monkey, Star Island, Nature Girl, Skinny Dip, Sick Puppy, and Lucky You, as well as 5 best-selling children's books. His latest book, Razor Girl, is about a lovable con woman and a disgraced detective who team up to find a redneck reality star. And if you have any friends who want a good laugh, buy them this for Christmas. NPR Books describe this as darkly funny, unapologetically crazy, and more Florida than a flamingo eating a Cuban sandwich while singing Jimmy Buffett songs. Please welcome Carl Hiaasen and Scott Turow.
This looks like a witness table.
Yeah, it's a very legal feeling. So Carl and I have known each other through the auspices, principally, of our dear mutual friend, Dave Barry and Michelle Kaufman. So we thought we would just chat and then eventually open things for questions, if that's okay. So since I've seized the microphone in my usual fashion, I wanted to start by asking about Razor Girl, and there is a amazing opening incident in Razor Girl, in which a razor is involved.
Yes.
And as you go through the book, it turns out that the character who is employing the razor in an act of female hygiene, that she says she had read about this first in the newspaper.
Yes.
And of course I said to myself, I bet I know someone else who had read about this in the newspaper.
Right.
So did the germ of Razor Girl start with something you had read?
Yeah, there was an actual, the book opens with what you think is a car accident down in the lower Keys where a woman is driving a vehicle and grooming her, I think the newspaper used the phrase bikini area, while she was driving, and crashed into a car full of tourists around mile marker 22 or 23. And my oldest son had sent me the article, I think it was in the Key West Citizen, so it went up on the sorted corkboard that I keep those kinds of articles. And for years, I had it up there, and I thought about, I wanted to put it into novel, but I thought there was no way I could possibly improve on it fictionally. And so then I finally just got to be too much. The possibilities got to be too much. In real life, it was an honest-to-God accident. She was on her way, she told the authorities, to a date in Key West. Her companion was her former husband in the car with her. And but in the novel, the character, it turns out not to be an accident, and she turns out to be sort of one of the great engines and the great provides a great amount of energy for the novel.
But a terrific character.
Yeah, I love her, but yeah, I stole it. Yes, the answer is yeah, I stole it right out of the newspaper, as I often do. So yeah, it was this is a target-rich environment, South Florida. If you're a novelist, and so now it's my turn to ask a question because I finished testimony about a month ago, and the writers hate it when you read a book that makes you feel lazy and useless. And I read Scott's book, and there was so much research involved, and it was all incredibly interesting stuff. Part of it takes place at the International Court in the Netherlands, and part of it in Bosnia. And I was just so impressed, and also as a writer, curious as to how you learned as much as you did about those events and the whole process of international law, which is much, much different than your own background. But it was one of those, I just couldn't, reading it. And I come from a family, my dad was an attorney, my grandfather's an attorney, my oldest son is an attorney, and my ex-wife is an attorney. None of those events are connected in any way, but what I'm trying to say is I appreciate the law. I didn't have the chops for law school, but when I read this, I thought this is a whole nother level, and I wanted to hear about how you researched it.
Yeah. Well, the germ of the book came, I was in The Hague in the year 2000, and went to a reception at the American ambassador's house. And there are all kinds of international courts in The Hague. There were 6 criminal courts. She invited a number of young American lawyers who worked there. And I found myself in a circle of men and women, and they all agreed on one thing: you've got to write a book about this place. And they had good reasons. They were like, the cases that are investigated and prosecuted there are massive and important war crimes cases, grim but important. And they said there's a lot of diplomatic intrigue in the courts and a lot of back channel stuff. And many of the people in The Hague are there only temporarily. They're away from home, so some of them get a little frisky. That too had a certain promise for people, those of you who've read my novels. Usually when people tell me that they have got a great idea for me about a book that I ought to write, just an unbelievable injustice, a case of massive judicial corruption, what they have in mind is their own divorce proceedings. So. But this sounded a little more promising than that, and so I always kept the idea in mind. It wasn't quite as laden with potential as a woman engaged with a razor blade as she drove in a vital in a vital area. But
But see, here we go from war crimes to Big Pine Key, razor play, and it just, it's a wonderful world of fiction that we live in, but it just seems like another universe to me.
you know, so I've always promised myself I would do this, and about 5-6 years ago, I began, and actually learning about the International Criminal Court was not, it didn't seem particularly daunting to me, because for most of my time in my other life, I've been a litigator, principally a criminal lawyer, but there's always a subject area involved, particularly in civil cases where you've just got to learn stuff. So that didn't seem that hard, and a lot of the law that's followed in the International Criminal Court is based on the common law, which is basically American and British law. So that wasn't hard. It wasn't hard to see the proceedings of the International Criminal Court, because it turns out they're streamed live on the internet. So except for the time difference, you know, but I could watch the International Criminal Court as I sat in my bathrobe, which is what I did often. But to get the milieu of the court, I felt like I had to go there. And so I made 3 separate trips to the Netherlands. And then I also spent a long week in Bosnia, because the book ends up being about the American peace enforcement effort in Bosnia, which at the time the novel opens, it concluded 10 years before. It's supposed to be an uninvestigated disappearance of 400 Roma refugees from this area encircled by American soldiers. And Bosnia is a fascinating place. I was embarrassed, frankly, about how little I had actually learned about it at the time the Bosnian War was taking place. And probably the single best story to tell about what happened in Bosnia was the American involvement, and I get this from my friend Tom Miller, a high school buddy who ended up as the American ambassador there at the time. And what spurred President Clinton to pay attention to Bosnia was the opening of the American Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. And Elie Wiesel was there as the principal speaker. And he said, here is a monument to the notion of never again. And then he turned around and looked at Clinton and said, and yet it is happening again right now, today, in Bosnia, less than a day's drive from the Nazi extermination camps. And equally horrible things were happening, albeit to a much smaller population. And Clinton kind of went back to the White House and was like, what the hell is he talking about? And that ended up being the precipitant for the American involvement in both stopping that war and then keeping the peace there. So I went to Bosnia, and I faced the task, of course, is you've got really grim material. How do you make this entertaining? Because that, frankly, is what I want to do. I want people to keep turning the pages.
No, and you can't help but learn a lot when you read it. I mean, again, as a writer, and you read something like that, you feel sort of guilty that you're not writing about larger themes. But from mine, whenever I'm writing novels, it's purely psychotherapy for myself. It's the only socially acceptable outlet for the way that I feel, and so it's no bigger than wrestling with whatever demons are in my head at the time. But I always admire, it's just a great thing to be able to read fiction and learn so much. Probably learn more than you would learn from any textbook or historic document on it. And the way to do that is the storytelling.
Yeah. When did you first start writing fiction, Carl? Because it wasn't right at the beginning of your career as a writer, was it?
Well, in college, actually, I worked as a ghostwriter, believe it or not, when I was at Emory for a couple of years early on, before I went to the University of Florida. They asked me they hooked me up with a doctor who wanted to write a couple books, and he had the material, stacks and stacks of it, but he wasn't, I'd never written a book before, but he wanted, it was structure, it was some rewrite, it was some other things, and they both ended up getting published.
Huh.
And one of them by Scribner's, and so at a very young age, I thought, well, maybe I can do this, but then you got sort of sidetracked by the journalism career, and especially coming to the Herald at the time, I was, in the newsroom in the 70s and 80s, and 90s, which was you were consumed by covering the news here. The news here was wilder than anything you could possibly put down in fiction. It was an extraordinary time, but when I got here, I started. Bill Montalbano was a great foreign correspondent of the Herald, and he had been my editor. And it started out. We were covering the cocaine wars when they first started in the 70s, and there was a character. And I hope he's not here. I hope he's not out yet. But his nickname was he was an assassin from Medellin, Colombia, who had been sent here to kill people in the drug wars. And the story was he'd gotten in and out of the Dade County. He was in and out of the Dade County jail all the time. And he came up with this clever idea of changing his name. And they kept letting him out. He would just give a different name. And we had all his different mug shots. We had everything. And he was the very first El Loco in the Miami Herald. Since then, if you Google El Loco Miami Herald, there'll be like 15 of them. But this was the first guy. And his name was, I'll never forget, it was Conrado Valencia. And but it was such an incredible character to write about that Montalbano said to me, we ought to write a book. And I said, well, yeah, I mean, writing fiction collaboratively isn't easy. But I thought, okay, I'd done this ghostwriting thing. I could probably do this too. And we wanted to do a book set in the cocaine wars. And so we did 5 chapters together, sort of dividing up characters and time frames and everything. The deal was that Bill, the whole impetus for this was that Bill wanted to buy a swimming pool. And he said, I don't care how much we make, but I just want to make enough for a down payment on a swimming pool. His wife Rosie wants a swimming pool. So, okay, we do 5 chapters. I don't have any expectation it's going to get published, but we sent it, Pete Hamill, who's a very dear friend of mine, said, send it up to me, I'll give it to my agent. And he gave it to his agent, who gave it to another agent, who called us up about 3 weeks later and said, I sold your book. And I called Montalbano. I'm all excited. We're going to get a book published, And
he's going to get a swimming pool.
And he's going to get a swimming pool. But typical Montalbano, there's a long pause. And I said, Bill, we can't believe it. Esther sold the pages. We're going to get a book published. He goes, I guess that means we got to finish the damn thing. So that was the great literary moment. But we ended up doing 3 together. But they were more traditional thrillers, really using real life stuff from our own reporters' notebooks. So they were not nearly as warped or disturbing as what I would write later. But that's how I got started.
So where does the warped and disturbing come from? Because I have to tell a story about Carl, who is, I've seen him on stage by himself, and he's actually a fabulous public speaker. And his novels, most of the characters, like in Razor Girl, are fast-talking, kind of smart Alex. And when you spend time with Carl in private, he's very circumspect, even, I would say, shy. And so over the years, we've met Carl's wife and Feria, and I, being a guy, I would never ask this kind of thing, but my wife Adrienne said to her, Carl seems like he's kind of shy. And she proceeded then to tell us the story of their romance, which was that Carl was single and would come into the restaurant where she was the hostess receptionist every night to eat. And eventually, she's a lovely human being in every regard, and she could kind of feel that his attention was on her, but, when she would look back, he would look away. And this went on for months. She began to get the idea, this guy's going to ask me out. And, You know, he seemed like such a nice person that was actually a pleasing idea to her. And so she did the things that people do when they're trying to send cues that this is okay. He still couldn't do it. So month after month after month, finally he mumbles, you know, you want to go out? And they did go out. They had a wonderful time, but it was like their second date. And Carl said, you know, I've got this professional thing that I've got to do. Would you mind coming with me? And so she goes with him, and she's stunned. They open the door, and there are 2,000 people sitting there to hear Carl. And she says the first thought that went through her mind was, oh, that poor man. So,
well,
so where do these people who are not really like the centered, decent Carl Hiaasen that we know, where do they come from?
Those are two fine words you used to describe me that I'll not forget, because I don't hear that often, even in my own house. But let me finish this story. The deal was, I was shy and all that stuff. But here's what happened was I couldn't, I had a collection after my divorce. I went back to my childhood hobby of mine, which was collecting snakes. I had a it was Florida. I grew up in West Broward County. There wasn't much to do. So I went back, and I probably had 15 or 20 snakes under the house I was living down the Keys. I had them in tanks and everything, and they were not poisonous snakes, no big deal. But it's a hard thing to introduce someone into your life when that aspect has to be explained. But my wife Fanya's son also had a snake. He had a little pet boa constrictor. So there was a pet store. Now, if you have these kind of snakes, they require food, and the food usually has to be in the form of a live rodent, okay? So there were trips you had to make and ways you had to transport rodents back to the homestead. And so, but it was right near this restaurant where she was working. So I'd pop in, and I'd literally have a bag of frickin' rats in my hand. I'm not lying to you. And they make noise. They don't just sit in the bag and say, I can't wait to be in a cage with some snakes. They're already hip to something bad is gonna happen to them. So, you know, I'm trying to hold this bag. Hi. So it was hard to make like a normal, hey, can I get your phone number? I gotta. So one day I went in there and I popped my head in there and I didn't have the snake. And I saw her and I said, hey, I'm just going to be next door at the pet store. And I said, yeah, we got to go out sometime. And I went over to get my rodents, and she ran after me, and she put her phone number in my hand. She said, you're going to have a hard time calling me without the number. You didn't ask for the number, you idiot. So anyway, but so you call about what's the sick part? That's the sick part. That's, I mean, is that I had a whole house full of snakes. And what are you going to do? How do you ask a woman? Well, I mean, you know, it's hard. I got rid of them after a while. But the worst part was I ended up letting a bunch of them go. I didn't want to just give them away. I kind of like, so I let them go in the yard, and it was nice. It kept the neighbors on their toes.
It sounds a lot like Razor Girl, actually.
Yeah. But there is a disturbing, but I don't think you can grow up in South Florida and not be affected by it in some way. And I want to ask a movie question.
Sure.
Can I ask you a movie question? Because I told him I was watching the film of Pursuit.
There is, by the way, in Razor Girl, a portrait of Hollywood agents, and Carl may never have anyone represent him again.
Yes, it was not terribly flattering, but it wasn't also terribly inaccurate. But I flipping through the cable there, and Presumed Innocent was on, and I thought, I sat there basking in the realization that it's possible, it obviously is possible to get a good movie made from a novel, and thinking about that, how much, I mean, and everyone that's ever worked on anything that they were working on for me, they were always the nicest. I mean, they weren't obnoxious, they weren't smart people, but they seldom turn out like the book, and they seldom. And you always end up spending the rest of your career as a novelist trying to explain a movie that was made from your book that didn't turn out quite like your book. So it's a burden and a curse. The check is great if it clears, but the burden that you carry. But in your case, how much did you have to do with the movie? I mean, did they?
I always say to authors who think they are going to control what happens in Hollywood that the best thing to do is don't cash the check. If that's the last control you have
Right.
when you sign the back of that check. And I was treated really well, and I frankly, every experience I've had, you know, one of my friends says about Hollywood that you have to learn to accept the bitter with the bad. But, and, you know, things have not worked out sometimes. I've sold lots of books where the movies never get made. I did a pilot script last year set here in Miami, and reminded me, like, as often happens with pilots, it didn't get picked up. One of my friends says that, you know, pilots are like sperm in the sense that many are called but few are chosen. So, but you know, Alan Pakula, who made that movie, was just really nice to me, and you know, I was welcome on the set. I got to know Harrison Ford took the trouble of actually coming and having lunch at my house, and I became fast friends with Brian Dennehy. And Brian said something to me the first time I met him that I've always recalled. He said, "Look, if we filmed everything in your novel, it would take 14 hours. And he said, we're going to be lucky because the studio wants to turn over the audience and the exhibitor wants to turn over the audience and sell popcorn. We'll be lucky if we get 2 hours." Presumed Innocent ran 2 hours and 8 minutes, as it turned out. He said, so the best movie made from a novel is going to be an abridgment, just like you read in the Reader's Digest. And a lot of the secret sauce of the good movie from the good book is you get a really great abridger, whether it's the screenwriter or the director or that collaboration. And but with all of that said, you know, Alan tried to hide from me the fact that they were going to change the ending of my novel, and for the movie, and they did. They shot it. They didn't like the fact that the murderer went free. They thought American audiences would never accept that. So instead, an insane asylum was invoked, and I heard this story from Harrison, and I heard the story from Alan, who said that, well, you know, the preview audience didn't really, they liked the movie, but they weren't, you know, they were a little wishy-washy about the ending. Harrison describes a scene in which they're throwing popcorn boxes at the screen. They were so upset with the ending. And so what ultimately happened was they just got out of it fast. The movie opens with a shot of an empty jury box. That's the last shot. That had already been done as the opening, and they just did a new voiceover, and Harrison recorded it, and they tacked it on the end of the film and got rid of their funky ending. But, you know, did I have any control over that? No. You know, I haven't had control over the things that have happened subsequently. Dustin Hoffman bought one of my books, and you know, it's great to meet him. Very warm. He's really a remarkable talent. And he said, I want to make a movie that you're going to be really pleased with. I want the movie to be completely faithful to your vision. And about 2 days later, the phone rings, and it's Dustin. He says, well, how would you feel if I changed the ending?
Yeah. I mean, that is the disease. I mean, it's not, it just happens. I mean, when they were shooting striptease in Florida, I remember I'd only been to this set, I think, maybe once or twice, but then there was a long silence. Everyone's as nice as they could be, everybody. And the screenwriter, Andy Bergman's a great screenwriter, it was good. But then I get a call saying, oh, we're we're going to reshoot the ending, because they'd sent me some draft of the screenplay, and the ending was all right because it was close to the book, and authors are always flattered if that happens. But you're living in another world, because they had screened it. It was the same thing. They had screened it, didn't like the ending. So now they were adding a big shootout at the end or something. But even at that age, that was the first time I'd been through it, I knew when the death knell, when that phone call, when they say they're reshooting the ending, it's usually not good. In your case, the movie was still, a huge hit. But I mean, I'm not sure, that necessarily a novelist's idea of ending, when you try to do it either in a literary way or a way that's true to the story, is what they want, the big third act of every movie. And every writer you talk to has a story about how they took the ending of the novel and wrote a whole new third act on it. And there's just no escape. And like you said, once you take the money and once you cash the check, the most you can hope is that they'll be nice to you, and that maybe you'll get to meet some of the actors and actresses. And if you're lucky, you get to go to a screening, or they'll send you a DVD to watch. But usually on the food chain, the author of the actual work that is being adapted is not even visible on the food chain. You're somewhere really down in the muck. But they make you feel
kind
like
of behind the drivers,
right, and they make you feel important, and they do. I mean, and it's not like they don't respect your work. It's just like it's a different beast. It's a completely different kind of writing. Same with the television pilots. I mean, a pilot is what, 60 minutes on cable with that's with no commercial interruptions. So can you imagine? And you're taking a novel. Let's say you're going to do a 12-segment limited miniseries, and you've got to organize and cut up your own novel. If the novelists themselves had to do it, there wouldn't be anything on television, because you couldn't bring yourself to do that surgery. They need to bring in those people that are heartless and say, no, this works, this doesn't work. Yeah, you have to.
Yeah, people say, have you ever done an adaptation of one of your own books? And I say, no, it would be like performing surgery on myself. It's just, you can't do it. Hemingway's advice to novelists whose books were being bought by the movies was, go to the California-Nevada border and meet the producer there. Grab the check, throw the book over, and run like hell in the other direction.
Yeah. But it's interesting, a lot of those great writers of that time dabbled in or tried to be screenwriters as well. Fitzgerald most famously, and they either drove them nuts or made them drink more than they already drank. But it was just as maddening a process then as it is now. The difference now is the demand for content is so extraordinary because of what's happening in cable. And
right.
Because I mean, that there's just it's a whole different sort of marketplace, and they're looking for something different. And it'll drive you crazy if you sit and worry about it. It will make you absolutely nuts, I think. And the best thing you can do is just go write the next novel.
Yeah, totally. Because not only do I have no idea what they want in Hollywood, it turns out that most executives don't have any idea either. So.
The meetings are the best when you want to come to they're called pitch meetings. Do you want to come to the pitch meeting? That's just what I want to be doing at my age, is pitching some project to some 28-year-old kid. It's everything you can do to remain civil and straight-faced for most of it, because the stuff, it's just hilarious. It's self-parody, and the fact that they even are having you there is humorous in a sense. Like anyone gives a rat's ass what you think. They don't. Nobody in the room cares what you think. They just think it'll be cool to have the writer there.
Okay, back to Razor Girl. Okay, there's a question. Are they going to make a film out of Razor Girl?
Oh, here's what's happening with that. It's the TV thing. It's Bad Monkey, but because the book before Razor Girl was called Bad Monkey, it was also set in lower keys and had the same main character.
Right.
So it's kind of two things in one, and and it's the pilot and all that. So I'm in the process of that. And you know what happens is, like, there's so many people go to, they'll go to Netflix or Showtime or HBO or whoever's doing it, and then someone will take the project and they'll get the first draft, and they don't like, someone else will get the project from them. You don't even know who's got the project anymore. This is a true thing. It was another book I had that they optioned. They were all excited for some old book, and I never got a contract. I never got one piece of paper saying that there was a deal. And by the time I tracked it down, these guys had already written the pilot, submitted it to Fox, and it had been rejected before I even had a contract. It was over before I even, I mean, that's Hollywood. And you're going, shouldn't somebody along the way have let me know where this was? Or who was? I had no idea who was even writing it.
John Updike had a story that he first knew that the movie of the Witches of Eastwick had been made when he saw the marquee at his local theater in Ipswich, Massachusetts. So.
No, so that's where you are on the food chain. That's about it. So but it's not a bad place to be, honestly, because it helps you not only stay humble but sort of true to your craft, which is the one thing it's all you've got is how you write, and all you've got are your readers of your books. And if you're trying to, and some people are successful, they set out to write a novel that's going to be made into a movie, and they see the movie in their head before they have the story, or before they envision the novel, and that's great if you can pull it off. But I couldn't begin to do that, set out that in such a calculated way, saying this will make a great movie. Why don't I write the novel? But there are people who do it and do it successfully. I can't. I couldn't do that.
This brings to mind a Miami story. I'm sitting in my law office and the phone rings, and guy introduces himself and he says, I'm a criminal lawyer in Miami. And he starts telling me, he says, I got this great idea for a novel. And he starts pitching it out, and I'm like, I'm sorry, my lawyers tell me I can't listen to story ideas. I can't. He says, I don't really need you to. I don't really need you to listen anyway. I said, my advice, just, write the book, or get a tape recorder and talk the book, if that's what it is. He says, no, he says, I don't need any advice about writing the book. He says, I just want to know how I'm going to sell the movie rights when I do.
Oh, God, yeah. I can almost imagine that phone call. The criminal bar in Miami is entrepreneurial. They always have been. Back in the day when they were representing some really dangerous people, you had to be careful about those kinds of phone calls.
Yeah.
They did not want movies made of them or about them.
I learned that the hard way. But anyway, is it time for some questions? Should we invite questions from the audience? 10 minutes worth of questions. It's always hard to get the first person to ask a question. Here we go.
Mr. Turow, I enjoyed the book. It was wonderful. All the characters were phenomenal. You were asked about how you researched Hague and Bosnia. How did you get into the Roma part? Where the gypsy background? That's a fascinating thing, especially here in Florida. I heard that Rosa Marks was just arrested again somewhere out west.
So this is a refugee camp of Roma who are who are the purported victims of this massacre. And this was another thing that I had on my writer's to-do list, Carl's figurative corkboard. And this all was precipitated more than 40 years ago when I had a relative who was in the hospital in Chicago, and he was going through the long, slow process of dying, unfortunately. And I walked in to see him one day, and the hospital was in turmoil. And wasn't hard to figure out why, because in every reception area there were huge encampments of gypsies, the Roma were customarily referred to in those days, and the nurses were in an uproar because, watches and cufflinks were disappearing from some of the patients' rooms. And the local gypsy king was dying, and they were sitting vigil for him. I walk in a week later, no Roma. They're gone. And of course, I divined that the Gypsy King had died, as it happened the night before. But what was striking to me was, this is more than 40 years ago. You could still, hard to believe, but you could still smoke in an American hospital. And in the waiting rooms were these kind of elegant, tall ashtrays on stanchions with this cylindrical thing on the top, and you tap the ashes, and then you'd press a button, and the ashes would go down. And I noticed that not only were the Roma gone, but so were all of the ashtrays. And my response to this was not what, frankly, it could have been at other moments in my life, which is, a fairly bigoted response. Instead, I sat there and I thought, wow, these people have a different way of looking at the world than I do, because, I would be thinking about the fact that sooner or later I or somebody I love is going to get sick. The last place in the world I would want to be unwelcome is at the hospital. And yet, that was not the way this group of people saw the world. And I thought, they've persisted for thousands of years. I want to understand what gives with the Roma. And that really was what precipitated the presence of the Roma in the novel. I learned a great deal about Roma culture, but as to the story that I was telling, one thing I learned is that the Romani language does not have a past tense or a future tense. It is all present. So.
Hi, my question's for Carl. First, I want to thank you. A few years ago, I work at a middle school library up in West Palm Beach, and several years ago, I emailed you about coming to our school, and you sent me a handwritten letter to the school, and I took it home. My husband goes, "What in the world is Carl Hiaasen doing writing you?" So thank you for that.
Oh, sure.
Also, are you going to be writing any more books for kids?
Oh, yes, ma'am. I'm just finishing up a book now for kids. It'll be out next fall, I think. Yeah. So I've been alternating with the adult novels and the novels for young readers for a few years. I'd sort of skeptically gone into that. An editor had asked me to see if I could write for kids. I thought she was out of her mind. Well, if you know what some of the stuff in the grown-up books are, why would you want?
Right.
Why would you want your children exposed to
Right,
that?
because
I think.
You would think that the beginning of Razor Girl would be perfect for a young adult novel.
Just put it to the
I'll tell you one scary story about that, because I had nieces and nephews who were of an age, my stepson and then now my youngest son, and I've always been oddly pretty rigid about when you can look at these books. And I know you hear a lot of stuff at school, and I know it's all bad, but I'm still not comfortable till you're 13 or 14, and even that, but the truth is they know everything, but nonetheless, so when a grown-up book comes out, and this was when, I think when Bad Monkey came out, I was in an event here in Miami that Mitch had put on, and there was a line, and a woman was coming forward, and if she's here tonight, she'll either verify or denounce me, but there was a young girl, and I'm guessing maybe 11, 12 at the oldest, and she's holding a copy of Bad Monkey, and her mother's with her. So I'm thinking she's just holding it for her mom, and her mom's gonna, and I said, "Is that for your mom?" And she goes, "No, it's my book." And all I said, I looked up and I go, "Mom?" And she goes, "Oh, we don't believe in censoring anything Julian reads. We don't believe in censoring any of it." And I go, "Mom?" She goes, No. And the girl looks at me and says, You don't have to worry about this. I've already read Lolita." I said, "Okay, I'll sign it from here you go." But I mean, and
It's true what you said, though, when, because I have kids that will say, "Oh, I've seen the movie," and I'll say, "No, read the book," because like in Hoot, you describe the snakes,
yes.
and in the movie, they don't even really show them.
No, they were queasy on the set of
Yeah.
Hoot about putting the snakes in. I don't know why, but
That's what I tell the kids, go back and read the book, because
Yeah.
there's chapters in the book that the movies don't even take.
No, it's been one of the great joys with the kids' books because they, shockingly, they're in the curriculum of schools all over the country. So I get letters from kids everywhere, some of whom have never seen, like the little burrowing owls that we had when I was growing up and other things. And many of them aren't in Florida. So, but nonetheless, they plug in. I think they identify with sort of not just the sense of not environmentalism, but the sense that we're all connected, and they're fascinated with nature, and they love the message, and they love one other thing about kids, especially middle school kids, is that they love irreverence, and they love sort of smart-ass humor, and they love it when you make fun of grown-ups. And when I think about my career in journalism, that's pretty much what I've done for 40 years, is make fun of grown-ups, so it wasn't that big a leap.
Well, you definitely did that in Flush, so.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thanks.
This question is for Carl. I'm one of the lucky ones who got to see you and Dave Barry kick off your presidential campaign in Coral Gables.
Dave's
And
here somewhere.
I'm just sorry that you didn't get the nomination.
No, I'm in retrospect, I'm actually sorry we didn't get the nomination. But I would have been the Mike Pence character in that scenario.
That's probably a very fitting way to end today's panel. So please, thank you. Let's join and give
Thank
our
you
speaker
all.
a round of applause. Thank you.
That was great.